with Mariela Neagu, and with her incredible research at the #1 university in the world, she's been able to have an outreach that is beyond what anyone else really can have that opportunity to do. And I think the great opportunity here is having someone with your stature uh, be here today. So I thank you so much. And I really would love to hear you introduce yourself.
Mhm. Thank you so much, Brandon, for inviting me. Briefly, I am a researcher in children's rights and child protection in Oxford. I am Romanian as well. And about 20, just over 20 years ago, I was working for the European Union, for Brussels. And I was given responsibility to make sure that the money that came from the European Union for the children in institutions, in the so-called orphanages, would be would achieve the right thing for children. As you know, there was this issue with the conditions in institutions. So, and the European Union wanted to change that. Now, after that, this is how I came across international adoptions. So, what I think we understood quite quickly was there was a system which attracted children into the child protection system, and when a lot of children would be sent out internationally, would be adopted. But the system was very hollow, very shallow, in the sense that for a lot of children, there weren't post-adoption reports. Those which were not clear. There was a lot of talk, which was quite unsettling, about money changing hands, about corruption in this field, and or about children who left the country, but the identity papers were not in order. Secondly, Romania had an obligation to protect the children rather than export them. But there was a very strong narrative that, children would be better if they go abroad. Romania was, after communism, a system which was, I can talk about what it was like in those years and what it meant to be a woman before 1989. Anyway, so that's how I learned about children in institutions, about children in foster care, and children who are adopted. And I befriended a number of children who were teenagers at the time, whom I met in my work. So it was from them that I learned the insides of what it means to be in care. And I think they're just my friends, and we are still friends now 20 years later. And I think they inspired me to take this further into research and really understand how do we think about children in care? How do we respond? How does the state respond to children in care? And I wanted to understand, and that's my contribution, my research contribution, what were the experiences of those children who were adopted internationally. Like I said, I was very critical of the system, not just me, but my colleagues in Brussels as well, other people. We saw what was going on. We are not happy. We discussed those issues with the government, and as a result, international adoptions were stopped. It was difficult because it's a very emotional issue. So what we are dealing was not personal stories, but more systemic ones. How can the law protect a child that lives from a child protection system and arrives in a different legal system, in a different country, in a different language, with people the child doesn't know, and also the state behind who knew the child isn't able to protect the child anymore. So on one hand is the construction of international adoption, which is tricky in itself. On the other hand, is very emotional with people saying, this is the right thing for children. I was critical at the system. At the same time, I was hoping, yet those children were taken from Romania by families who really wanted them, so they should be fine. So my research was going to capture those perspectives of how they were with, like I said, with a hope that the children would be indeed uh, happy in those families without too much struggle.
So,
And in fact, yeah.
oh, sorry, but what was the first time you entered a Romanian facility, and can you paint a picture for uh, the viewers where it was, what it looked like, what were the supplies like, what were the children like?
Yes, absolutely. So the institutions, first of all, the first time I went into an institution, well, in several, was in 1999 when I started to work for that. I had an attempt before. I wrote to a charity. I wanted to volunteer as a student, but I never got a reply. Maybe because I was Romanian and it was very much populated with people who came from abroad and who were volunteers. So I visited many institutions all over the country. And the most disturbing institutions were those for young children who are for 0 to 3 years old, because you'd enter so many rooms of either babies or toddlers who were crawling, and it was a very disturbing image because nobody wants to see, children that young and crowded together without having, parents and grown-ups to care for them individually. The other disturbing images or difficult images were in large institutions like the one in Siret, which had children with special needs. It was about, I think, just under 200 children in there when I visited. It had been many more in the past, but even when I visited, the smell you read about, and also the fact that it had small children as well as grown-ups all together, and many beds in one room. And I actually have a picture from that trip, which was my first trip in the country to visit institutions just after I took that job. And I have this picture. It was this child with Down syndrome. I think he looked like being, I don't know, maybe 6 or 7 years old. And it was like, it's a like high five kind of picture. And in my mind, it was the promise that that institution was going to close. And I remember how I started to cry when I saw the government decision to close it down. And it wasn't with money from the European Union, but it was closed down. But in addition to those, there were many other institutions which were like boarding schools, if you like. Many institutions where children got an education. And that's what I found later in my research as well, that even in the same institutions, how children lived, uh, uh, experienced institutions were very different. It depended, it differed what age they went into the institutions, if they went with siblings or not, if the parents or somebody in the family explained to them why they should go to the institution, why it would be better for them. So those who are treated in a very human way, or who had a sort of social parent who had a staff member, they are the favorite of the staff member, or a mentor, a teacher, anybody. They did quite well in also in adult life. So most of them, they have jobs, they have family life. So it wasn't what people, I think, expected, but all the institutions were, going to failed children that were set to fail, that they would end up in the street, and that wasn't the narrative.
So was there a discrepancy in funding between and this is a question that I've gotten from about three people, was there a discrepancy in the funding that was given to uh, orphanages in the city compared to the rural areas?
No, I don't think that was the difference. So the difference was there were different periods of time. In the 1980s, I think it was the whole country was in a incredible economic crisis, to say the least. So Ceausescu, he wanted to pay all the foreign debt. He exported almost all the food. It was very hard for people to find food. Heating, anything, so many times I did my homework at the light of a candle because the electricity would be cut. At the same time, when he wanted to build that awful, horrible building, the children, the People's Palace.
The palace, yeah.
Yeah, the palace. That's the second biggest building in the world. So while all this was erected and he went completely mad, wanting the whole power to be concentrated, the parliament, the government, those who worked for him in that building and around it, people were starving. And of course, when people were starving, also the children in institutions were starving. And actually, the one young man I interviewed, he was born in 1984, so he could still remember life in an institution before 1989, before all the revolution, the change, the images on television, and also the aid which came to institutions from abroad. He remembered how he was eating stubs from cabbage, and he got sick, he got ill, and so on and so forth, apart from the violence from older children and all that. So I think what happened before 1999 was one story. What happened after 1989 was different. I don't think necessarily the fact that we were in villages, I came across very good stories, experiences of being in an institution in the village. And then, in fact, there is, I should have prepared the book. There is a book, I'll send you the link later, which Elisabeth Blanchet, a French photographer, did with children in a village near Iași, with children in institutions. And then she went like 20 years later or so and took pictures of them. And the album is with them being young and them being old. And you can see what surprised me about the book was to see that she found the same I found in my research with a different method with free interviews. Some went and stayed in the village and were kind of handyman. Very few of them emigrated abroad, work abroad. Some went to a monastery also because children in institutions, for them, faith was an important thing, and that's what kind of gave them hope and the hope of justice. And at least some of them became nuns or monks. So, and some went to university and were very entrepreneurial. I think institutions gave some of them agency. So it's a very mixed picture.
When I think about that sort of situation, I think about when Hitler was raising his youth and he brought in those private schools where he would promote nationalism and try to create the perfect uh, youths, and they would grow
Mm-hmm.
into
Mm.
become, and they were incredibly intelligent, skilled, and so on. And I was wondering, did Ceausescu try to follow that sort of model and it backfired?
I think you're right. I think he did. Uh, well, I think to some extent, but it didn't quite work that way. Apart from the friends I met from my job, I have a friend who grew up, who is nearly my age, who grew up in institutions from 1970s, so much earlier. I didn't research that. I've heard, and I think there is a historian in Bucharest who might know a little bit more about it. I think there was an intention that they would join like the secret police, and that would be a source to recruit them. But I don't think, certainly not in the cohorts I engage with since 1990. I don't think that was the case. I think so. Originally, he wanted Romania to be an independent country. He wanted to play this sort of self-determination idea that Romania is neither with Russia nor is independent, kind of. So for that, he wanted a big nation. To have a big nation, he wanted the baby boom. In the 1960s, the fertility rate, the number of children being born was decreasing. So number one, the abortion was banned. Number two, there was no contraception available. And being a woman in those years in Romania, it felt like the state controlled your body and your intimate life, because a lot of women were working in factories, and in factories there would go doctors a few times a year to check who's pregnant, to make sure that they would not terminate their pregnancies. It's something which is so surreal. It's hard for us to understand these days.
And it was promoted with benefits that you'd get a bigger apartment and more assets, essentially.
To some extent, yes. But of course, that system had its own, kind of privileges. So yeah, the idea was that people should have children, and then the state would look after children. They were so obsessed with it, but the secret police got involved. Women who would do illegal abortions, 10,000 women died. But that didn't mean automatically that women who had children who were not planned because they couldn't have contraception or because they couldn't have an abortion, it didn't mean they necessarily placed their children in institutions. A lot of the children who were taken in institutions were against their mother's will. And I think I watched your TV program, and then I looked at the comments, and there are at least 2 comments from women who were told that their children had died, or they were told that their children were sick or were underweight. And then the state either took them away and had them adopted internationally, or placed them in institution without being concerned that the mothers would know where the children were. The Romanian women do not have a different DNA from any others. They were the victims of that kind of oppression, and that oppression continued after 1989 in many cases, because there was a pressure that the narrative changed. It's like, oh, you can't offer to this child what another family can. And I think it's hard for anyone who didn't live in those times to understand that Romania really was like a prison. We live in a globalized world. We've got the internet. We can watch television or have sources of information, perhaps too many these days, from all over the place. And it's very hard to put yourself in the place of somebody who has never ever seen anyone from abroad, who all they knew was, hunger, a very oppressive experience, a lack of trust in other human beings, because you never knew, even if you made a political joke, if one of those people would be who heard you was connected to the secret police. They would report you, and you would be interrogated and all that stuff. So very, very oppressive state. then the revolution happens, and all of a sudden it's this chaos. The images are shown on television, lots of people come, and a lot of them come to adopt children, and then they find out that the children weren't adoptable, and all of a sudden there are, people in between trying to help, thinking, this is the right thing for children, thinking this is, it would be great to help those people, it would be great to save children from institutions, but many children were not adopted from institutions, but actually from poor families. It's a complicated story.
So in 1989, one of the things that I decided to do to get information on what had happened was reach out to the former director of intelligence, Jan Dziwiak. And I think I said his name properly. And what he told me was that a it was an experience that Romania was going through, and he labeled it savage capitalism. And he said that it was people had their eyes open to something that they'd never experienced before, and there were opportunities, not necessarily on the family's end, but there were opportunities exploited by uh, individuals that started to get that capitalist thirst for Wall Street type wealth.
I agree, but that would be some of the people who facilitated adoption, so who kind of exploited vulnerability in many cases, vulnerability at both ends. Because at one hand, you'd have a vulnerable poor family who was kind of manipulated that that was the right thing for the children. And I don't really buy those stories that they sold the children, because I think, maybe they were given something. It's very difficult when you work with poor people, but I don't think most families, I don't think they sold their children as such.
And that's a huge point, because I think when we look at it from a capitalistic lens, where it's not a brand new society, where we're not seeing, especially people who grew up in the West or from the West, the reality of it all, which was that there was not just a demand for you to respect your authority, but it was an expectation, or your life could be at risk, and quite literally so. So when people speak about these individuals wish to sell their child, I don't think they walked up and said, baby for sale. I think it
No.
was more or less there were people that were in the power structure that were trustworthy before 89 in their eyes,
Yeah.
because they had to be. And it had a trickle down effect where it became a network essentially. And
Mm.
people were just, I'll give you $400 to do these documents. I'll give you this. I'll give you that. And at that point, it was, I want to secure my family. So I'm going to do whatever I need to do
Mm.
at the expense of whatever it is that happens. And the foresight wasn't there.
Yeah, no, absolutely. They sold the narrative that, oh, this, to the parents, this is right for your child. Then to the wider world, this is great for the children, because, otherwise they have no chance, they'll be doomed in Romania. And yeah, and I think, on the other hand, there were vulnerable people at the other end who maybe wanted a child, were expecting one, and those images kind of drove everybody, put everyone in a deeply emotional mood. So we can look at it this way now, so many years afterwards. But I suppose if you are in the middle of the battle or in the middle of a crisis, you can't really see the crisis in the way we see it now. I came across, when I was doing my research, there are quite a few books which are written by mostly American, some English women who went to adopt, and they put in writing their own stories. One of them, I was particularly amazed by it. It is called Romania out of the bulrushes. And it's the story of an American woman who went to adopt two children. And on the back of the book, it says, me, the daughter of a priest, I bribed judges, I bribed everybody to get my children. And, I forgot what I want, why I went there, which was basically to help. So a lot of moral dilemmas that, everybody went through, but in that, I can't find the word now, but in that sort of surreal, because it was also the culture clash. And she describes a couple of episodes I mentioned in the book. I quote, in one situation, an American woman goes to a village, and what she's met by a crowd of people. They knew that some foreigners were going to take children from the village. She is met by a crowd of people holding a baby up in the air, all dressed in white, kissing the baby. For them to understand that children are loved and they should leave that place, they should go away. And there is another, I think that's her story of, being in court and for the adoption papers, and the judge asking the woman whether she was attached to the child, and she says no, but then she could see the trace of the milk on her blouse, which meant that she had breastfed the child. So these are quite powerful stories.
Yeah, and from the perspective of childhood development, uh, the attachment for not just the child but also the mother in those situations can have, and they didn't have this data back then necessarily, but it was there's detrimental impacts in the psychology of the mother, but also the child obviously develops attachment disorder, which you see in most cases with the Romanian orphans. And on top of that, of course, the reason why it's been suppressed in Romania, these stories, and because just about everyone in some way has been attached to someone that is still going through some problem solving in their head or trying to find
mm,
answers, that they went through that detaching phase that probably absolutely destroyed them for that next year or so.
mm, mm,
And to
mm,
think that a child was never breastfed, anyone who's had children knows that the first thing you do when a baby comes out, after you get the eye drops and the basics done
yeah,
and the cut the cord, previous to the eye drops, you end up breastfeeding them, or at least giving them some
mm,
sort of formula,
yeah.
and that's their first smell and kids scent, the scent that uh, parents have on them. Kids recognize even up to like 4 or 5 years old, and while they're breastfeeding, even more so.
Yes, and it's more than that, because I think what this study does, it, and again, I didn't know what I was going to find. Obviously not when I started. Although I had worked in the field, I knew things about um, residential care, foster care, and adoption. But what it does, it compares the experiences of those who are adopted in Romania, same circumstances from the same institutions, with those adopted abroad, internationally. And it's quite powerful and quite heartbreaking. But I think this is the something new which this piece of this study brings. Those who are adopted in Romania, who grew up in secrecy, not knowing that they were adopted, finding out from while they were playing and being bullied, you are not your mother's child, that kind of thing. Uh, Still, they did, when I interviewed them. So this was when they were in their 20s. They're all doing really very well. They're all in contact with their adoptive parents. And this is not because, in some case, this young man left his adoptive placement when he was a teenager, his adoptive family. Because they had a fight, and he was told, "Oh, by the way, you are adopted." So we thought we should dissolve the adoption. They were having a teenage conflict, but even he had an army of social worker, lawyer, the adoption wasn't dissolved. He was back in contact with his family. It was a teenage crisis. Now, in inter-country adoption, quite a few of those I spoke to, they had those teenage conflicts, but they didn't really it didn't lead to going back to the parents. So they're in their 20s, have not speaking to their adoptive parents, or having incredibly complicated relationships, not being supported to go into higher education, into university. Uh, several of those. And I found out from a piece of research, a study which was undertaken in Canada, which looked at linguistic skills when children, for 3 groups of children who were about 10 or 11, I think. Those who were born in Canada to Canadian parents, other children who were adopted internationally at a young age, and some who migrated with their parents at a young age. So, but those who were in a position to learn a second language at an early age, and they were quicker in doing verbal skills or whatever than those 2 groups, migrant and adopted, compared to those who were born in Canada. So the conclusion of this study was that mother tongue is the language a child hears in the first 6 months of life before they speak. Now, I think that tells us the kind of impact moving culture, language, food, everything, all of a sudden, the impact it has on the child. I think, a lot of, and then it's life which goes on. Obviously, family life can be complex, either because people get sick, or they go through divorce, or there is domestic violence. So, all these things kind of kicked in different stories. And they contributed to, if we think from the perspective of the child, they contributed, adding more and more layers, more and more challenges. There is obviously the identity issue, which is always, something to deal with, which we had in domestic adoption as well.
And that's probably one of the biggest questions that I've gotten for you to answer is, you're leading right into it perfectly. Where does this desire for these kids that grew up and had no idea they were Romanian find out they're Romanian and suddenly want to, and in many of these cases, the adopted Romanians abroad, they have this uh, sudden urge and impulse, I would use is the word, to move back and assimilate into Romanian society.
Yeah.
How does that go from having just learning what colors on the flag were to suddenly wanting to identify?
I think, Brandon, that we have failed to ask the right, or research questions, or not to ask the right questions, but I think we have overlooked. I think, the narrative was, the story goes, they had all this trauma when they were little, so of course, they have all this struggle when they grow up. But like you say, this connection, and when the book comes out, which is in a couple of months, I think there are some incredibly powerful quotes which should sort of, I hope, inspire the research community to think about things differently, to the attachment to place. And it's not only for young people, it's that feeling of belonging, of not feeling, at home, but kind of dwelling between the two countries. And it's something which migrants have to some extent. I'm a migrant as well, and the saying goes that once I'm a migrant, forever a migrant, because you never feel fully into a country as belonging there entirely in the same way somebody who was born there is. But it's different when you make that decision as an adult, and it's different when you grow with that heavy luggage.
And that's what really confuses me, because if I were to look at it from like a behavioral therapist type perspective, I would think, oh well, the abuse is what they were used to when they were young in their formative years, and that draws them back to uh, an identity that was formed early on. But the surprising thing is that almost every single Romanian baby that was adopted has those same desires and feelings. And
Mhm.
it completely throws that theory out the window.
Yes, absolutely. I fully agree with you. And no, I think identity is much deeper. And in a way, the Convention on the Rights of the Child is right, because the one thing, it has one provision which is about children in alternative care, and it says, the state should support the families, but if the children are taken into care, they should take care that children maintain a continuity, which is, language, religion, and so on and so forth. So, and that as a psychologist, as a therapist, that continuity is one feature of identity formation. And if we think about it, the disruption of identity is so much stronger when children go into care. They change, their whole world change, and that is difficult enough. It is a change of social world. If you try to think in normal life situations, that happens when you get married, when you leave your home where you grew up, and you start your own family, um, or when a child arrives. And these are how humanity dealt with this. You have entire ceremonies like baby showers, like weddings, where social worlds are around that change. And now if you extrapolate and you think about the children who are adopted, they have that sudden, without any rite of passage, without any transition, without being. And I can understand that it's very difficult. Suppose you have the best possible adoptive parents who have all the understanding of all the knowledge, but then they think, okay, you teach them the language, you take them there, you are afraid as a parent, what if I want to stay there? And actually recently I listened to a program on Radio 4 in England about the Romanian children. And there was a story of a young woman who said, she was taken when she was a teenager, and that's extremely unusual, by her adoptive mother to Romania, to her family. And her adoptive mother said, if you'd like to stay there. And, she said, my adoptive mother, she was my mother. She was so selfless in, understanding. And that is, again, this is something which I discussed with several young people. That meeting, which happened in one case or a couple of cases in domestic adoption, in one case in intercountry adoption, of the two mothers meeting. As somebody said, it was like moving mountains. And that's, it's different languages, different cultures, and different fears and traumas, and so on and so forth.
So we head into 80, end of 89, start in 1990. When was the next time that you had interacted in Romania with orphanage staff, and was there any conversations or narrative that was more open in terms of discussion with authorities at that time?
Discussion about.
What to do? They didn't have a plan.
Oh no, but I had to I had to come up with a plan because Romania had this was this exceptional case when they were told, well, Barnes Nicholson, who is a British politician, was at the time responsible for Romania from the European Parliament anyway, and she said to the government, you either um, reform the child protection system or you can't become a member of the European Union. She also had a lot of knowledge about what the corruption in adoption, so she exposed these things. I visited uh, the majority of institutions in the country. I've been to, I think, with one exception, to every county. It's 41 of them. So in those years, 99, 2000, 2001, 2002, I worked there until 2006. I visited institutions. I engaged. I spoke to staff. I spoke to uh, everyone I could speak to. And I think with me the thing was I I was Romanian and I could speak with the children and engage with them differently and form those friendships. And it was that which really helped me understand what it meant because I was not brought up in any sort of advantaged socially or rich family, and I didn't think placing children in institutions was something which people would do. It was then I discovered how aggressive this policy was to take children into institutions. The other thing which I wanted to say was uh, when I was speaking about adoption in Romania and adoption abroad, was that the response was very different. So that we know all that research that having children at an early age in institutions is really bad. It damages them for life. Uh, but and that they have all these challenges, behavior challenges. Those who were adopted in Romania, they described the same kind of challenges. What was different was the response of the professionals and the response of the parents.
Mhm.
In the West, you had children put on ADHD treatment on medication. Also, I think because they were kind of labeled as being from the Romanian institutions, those dreadful places everybody knew from television. So it was even if the child maybe came from a family, the child had been adopted internationally from Romania. So it was kind of identification, but this is what it is. This is how it should be treated. Whereas, to give you some examples from those who were adopted in Romania, one of them said um, he had to leave kindergarten. He was expelled from kindergarten. Or another one said that he was the clown of the class and his mother moved him to another school. Another one that she had special needs and her mother struggled for her to stay in mainstream education. So they had this highly committed parents kind of not admitting that the child, not labeling the child, either the parents or the professional, everybody trying to get the child well early in childhood. And it seems to have worked. So,
Mhm.
health or medicine is also quite cultural because, maybe, if you have a surgery for something, maybe it will be not done in the same way in different countries, but more complicated issues such as mental health, then it's a very cultural approach.
And yeah, I have a few friends in Romania that are psychologists, and I have obviously friends in Canada that are the same. And the main difference A is that the system doesn't cover it in Romania, uh, and B that there's a holistic approach and there's more time allocated. You'll see the psychologist or psychiatrist for 10 minutes maximum in Canada. And in
Mhm.
Romania, they're almost on call. So
Yes.
that was a really shocking thing for me to hear the transition. In terms of those staff that were telling you and showing you all the changes that were made, did they speak about what the difference was compared to post-revolution in the orphanages?
Mm. Um, well, I didn't interview staff. I don't think they. First of all, I wasn't really interested because I really wanted the experiences of the children, of the young people. And with the stuff, I think it's a completely different discussion. I think, about moral luck, you might be a good human being, but you end up in a context where you are stressed and you can't, it's a culture which is wrong in where you work. How do you respond as an individual? That's a different discussion. I think it was very different because you had all this attention on the institutions, and there was more food. There was, well, uh, I think it was uncomparable with what was before 1989. Things started to change gradually. I don't think the food was a problem anymore, but um, some of the young people I spoke to were quite critical of the changes because they thought at some point it was better when they would be more involved in doing works and stuff being more firm, and everybody going to school or having teachers which were staff members in the institutions. That was seen as a great thing, and that was something when Romania started to reform. The philosophy was, oh, they need parents, so they started to recruit young people to work there, but that those who were teachers left the children's homes. So with that, a lot of clubs or help with homework disappeared as well. So yeah, it's they were not necessarily bad places, as bad as they were described. And to be
Mhm.
honest with you, I saw, not in Romania, but abroad. I visited children homes which are very small, like 3 children, and I was quite distressed by the loneliness I saw
And
there.
that's one of the things that really um, interests me personally is so we as the victims in this scenario, I mean, not so much myself who was adopted very early on, but the ones that lived there uh, for many years, uh, they think, oh, well, how could the staff live with this and so on. And I've seen in Canada, people who went through 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 years of schooling step into the field and completely self-destruct within 48 hours and walk out and try to find a new field because nothing prepares you to deal with an assortment of behaviors, especially if you've never actually parented a child. So when I think about the staff, of course, there's an element of compassion for them because they're the only, if they disappear, there's nobody to watch those kids. And even if it was minimal because there was so many kids at once, this is one of those things that I think need to be researched because it's not the fault of the worker in a sense.
Mm,
It's the conditions, the education, and the demand of them
mhm.
that somehow they manage to care enough to keep coming back every day. But obviously, what they had experienced needs to be shared at some point before they die because that generation's getting
Yeah,
older.
I agree. I agree with you. I agree, and I think that would be indeed it would be a useful to have their testimonies. Some of them. So as they were described by the children who are in institutions. Uh, I think some of them were just awful. That's what they knew. For example, scaring the children with putting a sheet over them, pretend they're ghosts to make children go to bed. And, a couple of children who grew up in different institutions told me that. But it wasn't, they were mainly controlling younger children through older children. So what we had in institutions, we had three kinds of children. Those who were vulnerable because they were very young, and were vulnerable to abuse from older children. Those who were protected were had either siblings who were older, and those who were kind of perpetrators. And extraordinary, in one interview, this young woman told me, she was abused. She describes how she was beaten by an older boy when she was a little child. When she grew up, and she said, I started to beat children, and all of a sudden I realized, what am I doing here? So this sort of moral agency, all of a sudden realizing that was wrong. Now, she was somebody who grew up in institutional care. She came from a Roma family. She was the only one in her family to go to an institution. And then she grew up in that large institution. And actually, she and others explain how sometime when they were, I think, nearly teenagers, all these changes started to happen. So less children in institutions, more space, furniture, personal belonging. She said, she was punished if she would answer back. And she felt, they could have done better for her. But at the same time, she's the only one in her family who went to school. And when she was helped to get a job, which those in foster care were not helped.
So
Um,
as a researcher, when you look at the lack of documentation on, I mean, what was it? Maybe 10 years ago, Romania actually started documenting and forcing everyone to have actual IDs. In 1990, is there any documentation of all children, their whereabouts, and is there a missing children's um, uh, database? And is there any way that we can come up with an actual figure of children not that don't have a voice and might have died, unfortunately, been um, on the extreme end, sold into sex slavery, trafficking,
mm.
organs, and then also obviously the ones like myself and the ones that went abroad. Is there any database that we could somehow get figures?
Unfortunately not, and I can't see how this could be done. But I think, yeah, I think there should be a beginning of restorative justice and try to, have it open to the public and understand and have a place where all this information is stored about, recovering. One of the young people I interviewed, as we were talking earlier, extremely, he didn't meet his birth family, his biological family, because when he started to look, by the time he started to look quite well, not late, but he was in his 20s. Well, in his 20s, his mother had passed away. He found out. He's still very attached to Romania, to the land, and he recently got his Romanian citizenship. So that, there are measures which could be done for, I think, every person who was adopted from Romania would like to restore their identity, at least, only partially, but legal identity or symbolically. I think it would be very meaningful to have an opportunity for them, if they want to learn the language, if they want to study or to work in Romania, to have a sort of institution who helps them restore their identity, their citizenship, and engage
Sorry, I've lost you for a sec. Oh, well, I've lost Mariela briefly. I'm just trying to figure out how I can get her back. Bear with me for a minute. Let's see. All right, so I'm actually going to run a part 2 on this, and I'm going to get Mariela back in the room. And we are going to have part 2 momentarily.